Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive into the hidden currents of history and prophecy. Have you ever had that feeling, that little whisper that maybe, just maybe, the full story of humanity, the whole timeline, past and future, hasn't quite been revealed?
Oh, absolutely. That sense that something's missing.
Exactly. Like there's this suppressed history, maybe secret knowledge just simmering beneath what we're normally taught.
Hmm.
Well, today we're pulling back that curtain. We're looking at what our source calls a shadowy second history. And honestly, it challenges pretty much everything we thought we knew about our past and maybe even gives us a terrifying blueprint for the future.
A big claim. We're essentially following a trail of clues, from ancient texts, trying to trace this unbroken line of influence that, according to the source, reshaped whole civilizations and might still be active today.
And it's that feeling of incompleteness you mentioned earlier. It's a very common, almost a spiritual angst, isn't it?
It really is, that feeling that things are disconnected, especially prehistory and prophecy. So our mission today is to unpack exactly that, a really contrarian perspective on ancient history. And it's surprising, often unsettling links to end-time prophecy. And we're focusing particularly on the role of giants and these unseen forces.
Okay, giants and unseen forces. And for this pretty extraordinary journey, we need some solid ground. What sources are we working with today?
We've got an extraordinary set, actually. Our main guide is a book called The Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2, How Understanding Prehistory and Giants Helps Define End-Time Prophecy by Gary Wayne.
Okay.
But we're not just relying on that. We're weaving in insights from various biblical texts, the King James, the Septuagint too, plus historical accounts from, heavy hitters like Josephus and Herodotus.
Wow, okay.
And even older writings, things like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Ugaritic texts, which don't often get discussed in these contexts.
So a real mix of sources, but why should you listening care about this? Is it just ancient history?
No, definitely not. This isn't just some academic puzzle or a theological debate club. The goal here is to provide, scripturally researched answers to some really deep spiritual questions, questions that often get pushed aside.
Hmm.
Understanding this shadowy second history, as the source calls it, could fundamentally change how you see current events, how you connect dots that seem unrelated, and maybe how you prepare for what might be coming down the line.
So it's about clarity, cutting through the noise.
Exactly. It's about gaining clarity instead of just being swamped by information overload, equipping you with knowledge.
Expert, that's quite the mission, clarity on something so, complex and maybe even unsettling. But, for someone hearing this for the first time, it all kind of hangs on who's giving us this contrarian perspective. Our source, Gary Wayne, calls himself a Christian contrarian. That's an interesting label,
It is.
especially when you're talking about hidden histories. What does that actually mean, being a Christian contrarian here? How does that shape his whole approach to this stuff?
Yeah, that's really the crucial starting point for getting where he's coming from, his whole framework. So Gary Wayne's basic premise, it starts with a critique. He looks at modern churches, both Catholic and Protestant, and argues they often restrict teaching on interconnected prehistory and prophecy.
Restricted? How so?
Well, but by maybe not connecting the dots fully or shying away from the more controversial parts like Genesis 6. And he says this is what leaves a lot of Christians with that uneasy spiritual sense you mentioned, that feeling that something's incomplete, disconnected, like they're not getting the whole story from the pulpit.
Right, that spiritual hunger feeling. I can see how that would resonate. But, don't most churches cover Genesis, cover prophecy? What specific gaps does he say are being left that would make someone feel like actually vulnerable to deception?
It's deeper than just general gaps, according to him. He argues that by leaving out key bits of prehistory, especially the role of, angels, fallen angels, and these giants, the whole foundational context for understanding prophecy gets lost. It's like trying to understand the end of a book without reading the first few chapters.
Okay, so the context is missing.
Exactly. So the Christian contrarian stance isn't about just being contrary for the sake of it. It's more like, the Bereans in Acts.
Acts 17.
Right.
Yep.
They receive the word with all readiness of mind and search the scriptures daily, whether those things were so. It's that spirit. He emphasizes you have to verify everything yourself, scrutinize it all. Don't just accept the party line, whether it's from academics, the media, or even, established religious figures. He applies that rigor everywhere.
That's a really strong parallel, the Bereans. It definitely highlights that idea of active checking, not just passively accepting things. But then how does he handle outside sources, especially ancient texts that might contradict the Bible. That must happen a lot.
It does. And that's where his core principle comes in, his anchor. Scripture is the ultimate judge of truth. Period. So any non-biblical research, whether it's from, say, polytheistic myths, ancient historians, even modern science, it all gets measured against the Bible.
Okay.
If some outside info departs directionally or runs contrary to Scripture in any way, he makes a note of it, but he considers it unreliable for understanding the Bible itself. His conviction is that if you really put all prophecy, all Scripture, around what Jesus said, remembering Revelation 19.10, the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy, then he believes the contradictions just melt away.
Jesus' words as the master key, essentially.
That's the idea. For him, they unlock the whole thing, especially prophecy.
It's definitely a strong case for a literal reading using Jesus' words like that. But, a lot of people see allegory as crucial for understanding these old texts, prophecy especially. How does he draw the line between what he sees as legit biblical allegory defined inside the Bible and what he calls reimagining it? Are there examples where a common allegorical take might actually, from his view, hide the literal truth?
Yeah, that's a really critical distinction he makes. He contrasts his literal approach with what he sees in, say, polytheistic religions, where they might reimagine the Bible to fit their own stories or justify things. For Wayne, real biblical allegory has to be signaled within the Bible itself. Scripture has to tell you it's being symbolic.
Okay.
External context, like history or culture, is okay only if it perfectly lines up with Scripture. He reads the Bible as this linear history, Genesis to Revelation, and sees clear signs where other books, like prophets or Psalms, slide into that timeline. He believes deviating from that literal reading, unless the Bible tells you to, is where spiritual error creeps in, or key prophecies get obscured.
So no forcing pieces, no leaving bits out. Let the Bible interpret itself. And this really careful, literal method leads him to his main thesis, which is pretty startling. This shadowy second history. What is this hidden version of events he's talking about? How's it so different from standard history?
He argues that behind the history we're taught, the sort of official version from the elites and institutions, there's this deeply hidden narrative that actually elucidates the enigmatic events of history. This shadowy second history, he says, is kept from public view. It's a shocking saga of secret societies, lost civilizations, unexplained events, and an unaccounted-for hidden hand of history.
Wow.
And right at the center of it all, he claims, it gyrates around the genesis of giants, the true house of dragon, which imposed their specious divine right to rule on humankind, and a terrible history and frightening short-term future begot and continued by the invisible ones, the Celestial Mafia.
Celestial Mafia. That's intense. So it's not just about big guys. It's about, like, a spiritual conflict, a lineage of control.
Exactly. That's the core of it.
That is a really intense picture. Secret societies, lost civilizations, hidden hand. It sounds almost like a movie plot. But he's saying, no, this is the real current flowing underneath. And central to this, he says, are the days of Noah and Lot as this crucial sign for the end times. Now, like most people, I always heard that as, pretty straightforward. People got caught by surprise by the flood. Simple warning.
Right, the standard interpretation.
But he's saying it's way more than just being surprised. How does he unpack that? What's the deeper link to now that goes beyond just, oops, didn't see that coming?
Yeah, that's where the nuance really kicks in. A lot of prophecy watchers see the days of Noah from Matthew 24, Luke 17, mainly as that warning. People were just living life, oblivious, didn't care about the coming disaster, and boom, flood. And yeah, that element's true. People will be caught off guard when the Antichrist makes his move. But the author argues this is a much bigger sign, an overarching indicator that covers the whole fig tree generation. It's a template, really, for how spiritual corruption looks right before judgment falls.
So not just the flood hitting suddenly, but the whole period leading up to it and the types of things happening then, that really broadens the scope. And how does he define days? Because days of Noah could mean, well, literal days or something much longer, right? Especially if it's a whole generation.
Great question, because the language is key here. The Greek word Jesus used, hamera, and its Hebrew root, yom, they aren't stuck on meaning just a 24-hour day. They can mean a year or a general time period, even a whole lifetime or generation.
Okay.
So the source argues Jesus is basically telling us, dig deeper. The days of Noah refers to Noah's whole 950-year lifespan, or at least that 120-year generation limit set in Genesis 6.3. Remember where God says, my spirit shall not always strive with man. His days shall be 120 years.
Right.
So it's an era, A whole season of history defined by specific spiritual conditions, not just a sudden event. That really ramps up the meaning of the warning, doesn't it?
It really does, a whole generation. So what kind of corruption was so widespread back then that Jesus would point to it as this direct, chilling sign for the end times? It can't just be general people were bad, can it? It must be something more specific, more insidious.
Exactly. It's far more than just general godlessness or violence. The author points specifically to Genesis 6, verses 11 and 12. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. He details this as shocking sexual sins, violence, all forms of abhorrent behavior, and a brutal state-sponsored polytheism.
State-sponsored polytheism.
Yes, this deep systemic corruption, not just morals declining, but a specific kind of societal and spiritual perversion that's the hidden context for the flood, he argues. And that's the template for the specific evils we should expect in the end times. It paints this picture of a world soaked in depravity, both physical and spiritual, driven by, well, dark forces.
And Luke connects Noah directly to Lot. What's the significance there? Linking a global flood to Sodom's very localized fiery destruction, it suggests a particular kind of sin is being highlighted in both cases.
Right. Luke 17 explicitly links them. Destruction by water in Noah's time. Destruction by fire and brimstone in Lot's. The implication, the author argues, isn't just about sin in general, but that similar Sodom-type sins, violence, corruption, and sexual violations of a really heinous kind were also rampant before the flood. Sodom's fiery end becomes this burning example, a parallel for the specific end-time judgment waiting for a world that reaches that same level of corruption. It's not just about being immoral, it's about a very specific kind of spiritual and physical boundary crossing that triggers God's wrath.
This sounds like there's a specific divine judgment element often glossed over, and the source points to 2 Peter and Jude as key texts here. How do they explicitly tie angels and judgment into Noah and Lot, adding this otherworldly layer?
These passages are absolutely fundamental to his argument. 2 Peter 2 says God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, reserved for judgment. That's talking about a specific angelic crime. Then Jude 1 links these angelic crimes, specifically sins by the sons of God and sins of their spurious offspring, the Nephilim giants, directly to Noah and Sodom. Sodom is set up as an example of eternal punishment of fire for fornication with strange flesh. That phrase, strange flesh, is crucial. It suggests a specific unnatural sin by these angels, physical illicit unions with human women, producing hybrid offspring. He argues it's not metaphor, it's literal boundary violation.
And this brings us to that war of giants in Genesis 14. If these angel-human hybrids were judged so thoroughly, how do these later Rephaim giants fit in after the flood? Seems like they shouldn't be there if the flood did its job.
Exactly the problem, right. And our source tackles it head on. He notes that these Rephaim giants are documented as roaming the earth shortly after the flood. They pop up in Genesis 14, right in the middle of that war of giants. And they're listed among the people living in the covenant land in Genesis 15, right before Sodom gets destroyed. So their position is this key recurring element. Understanding these post-flood giants, he argues, is absolutely critical for understanding the beast empires and end-time prophecy. They aren't just ancient history. They represent this ongoing transgenerational influence, a comeback of that corrupted line.
Okay, so if the days of Noah and Lot were about way more than just a flood, it really does sound like these giants are a huge piece of the puzzle, one that's been sidelined. What exactly are these giants the source talks about? How does he define them beyond just being tall? What are their traits, according to his research?
Right. He defines giants broadly first. Huge mythical beings of more or less human form with abnormally great stature and extraordinary powers. Pretty standard starting point. But then he immediately pushes back, saying this isn't just mythology. He points out that both sacred and secular history, plus myths from all over the world, consistently mention them. This runs directly counter, he says, to what he calls the Western scientific, historical, archaeological, educational, and Christian hegemony.
Hegemony, strong word.
It is. He argues these institutions systematically suppress what he calls ouparts, out-of-place artifacts, and any inconvenient history. They dismiss the whole idea of giants as just, collective ancestral segments of imagination. He's basically claiming there's been a cover-up of global evidence for giants.
That's a bold claim, a cover-up. What evidence does he offer beyond just pointing to myths? Are there, linguistic clues that might hint at something deeper about these beings?
Absolutely. He brings up the word gibberish. Today it just means nonsense talk,
Yeah.
right? But historically, he says, gibberish used to refer to the speech of demons and ancient giants who spoke quickly and often in unknown languages, like rapid, unintelligible, maybe even esoteric speech. Then he connects that to the origins of Indo-European languages, Aryan, Indo-Celtic, Indo-Germanic, which are kind of mysterious, linguistically speaking. He notes that early post-flood Scythians seem to have inherited an antediluvian Indo-European language, and he mentions the Tartaria tablets found in Romania.
Tartary tablets.
Yeah, they apparently predate Sumerian writing by maybe 1,000 years, but have almost identical symbols. He argues this points to a pre-flood global language and culture tied to these giants, a suppressed linguistic history hinting at a much older, connected world than we usually think.
Wow, language itself is a clue. That's fascinating. And he introduces this idea of a Nephilim world order. What was this antediluvian order, and how does it connect to how we think about power structures even today?
He describes the antediluvian giants, the Nephilim, as these spurious children of the divine ones and the absolute embodiment of power. Their influence, he argues, didn't just vanish with the flood. They left a trans-flood and transgenerational legacy.
A legacy? How?
By imposing, he says, a worldwide, feudal-like class system, state-sponsored polytheism, and controlled polytheist-inspired education system. These dynastic giant royals and their relatives, he claims, conspired through the generations to impose, enforce, and enslave humankind. He actually calls this the Nephilim World Order, or NWO. It's a chilling idea that the roots of human hierarchy and control might actually go back to these hybrid beings.
So it's not just about their size. It's about a lineage of power, a system built to enslave. Let's dig into the word giant itself. Etymologically, where does it come from? How does that back up his claims about their, massive size and power?
Yeah, he traces it back very carefully. English giant comes from Middle English giant, which came from Latin gigant, and that came from the Greek gigas.
Gigas. Okay.
Now, gigas, and the plural gigantes, was originally used for that monstrous race in Greek mythology, the gigantes. Think of figures like Briareus or the Hecatoncheires, often shown with like 100 hands and 50 heads. Hesiod describes them this way. They had to be enormous physically.
Right, you'd need to be huge for that.
Exactly. So the word itself, he argues, carries this ancient memory of truly immense beings, supporting that literal physical definition.
But what about that other Greek word, giganus, often translated earthborn? People use that to argue they weren't supernatural, just, born from the earth. How does he handle that?
He addresses that directly. He says, yes, gigantes and giganus did mean earthborn, but specifically in the sense of being born of gods or goddesses, but in the physical world, as opposed to being purely spiritual. Think of Gaia, Uranus, Kronos. They had like physical world DNA from divine interaction.
Ah, okay, born on earth, but from divine sources.
Kind of, yeah. And he backs us up by pointing to historical giant kings and heroes like King Gyges of Lydia, or the figures of Gog and Magog in British lore, whose statues were supposedly 14 feet tall. He's arguing these weren't just myths, they were real, imposing figures in history.
So the etymology suggests literal size, even with earthly connections. And he brings in some heavy hitters for corroboration, Josephus and the Book of Enoch. What do these respected ancient sources add to this, well, frankly, unsettling picture of giants?
Josephus is huge here. First century Jewish historian, right? Foundational stuff. He explicitly said the Genesis 6 giants were like the Greek heroes, unjust and despisers of all that was good. And he added that this was the constant opinion of antiquity.
Constant opinion of antiquity. Wow.
Yeah, he wrote quite clearly. Many angels of God accompanied with women and begat sons that proved unjust, on account of the confidence they had in their own strength. For the tradition is that these men did what resembled the acts of those whom the Grecians called giants.
It's a
Powerful, independent historical voice echoing the Bible.
That really is strong, especially coming from Josephus, living relatively close to that time. And the Book of Enoch, which the Bible itself actually quotes as prophecy that confirms this too, right? It seems to fill in details Genesis just hints at.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
First, Enoch especially lines up incredibly well with Genesis 6, but it gives much more detail. It talks about the sons of God being angels who lusted after human women and defiled their bodies, leading to giants.
It's pretty explicit then.
Very. Enoch 6 says, and the angels, the children of the heaven, saw and lusted after them. Come, let us choose us wives and beget us children. Then later, Enoch 15 basically asks the watchers point blank, wherefore have ye left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, and lain with women, and defiled yourselves, and begotten giants as your sons? It fits perfectly with Genesis and gives crucial context about what the angels did wrong.
Okay, now the big thorny question, the one that always comes up. If the flood was meant to wipe these giants and their corruption off the face of the earth, how on earth did they reappear after the flood? Our source mentions this controversial idea. A second incursion.
Yeah, this is where, admittedly, Scripture isn't super explicit. There's no single verse that just says, and then more angels came down after the flood. So the author looks at the main possibilities people have debated for ages.
Okay, what are they?
He puts them in three basic buckets. One, a second incursion by a different group of fallen angels. Two, maybe some giants were protected by angels or survived on another ark, like Utnapishtim and Gilgamesh, or Deucalion in Greek myth. Or three, the really unlikely idea they were somehow on Noah's ark, which contradicts the Bible saying only Noah's family and the animals were saved.
Right, option 3 seems pretty weak biblically. So between a second incursion and maybe some surviving elsewhere, which does the author lean towards and why? What evidence points him that way?
He definitely favors the second incursion and a second creation of giants by fallen angels. He argues it's the best option to explain the renaissance of absolute power in the post-Diluvian world. Why? Because he feels it fits better with the details documented in Scripture both before and after the flood.
How so? What details?
He looks at that phrase in Genesis 6.4. There were giants in the earth in those days. And also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men. He says, after that is ambiguous. It could mean after the first giants were created, but still before the flood. Or it could mean after the flood. Or maybe even both.
Okay.
He also points to some Hebrew words there. Ken can mean like manner, suggesting things were reestablished the same way they were before. And Ashar can mean again or once more. He sees these as linguistic hints reinforcing the idea of repeated incursions, a deliberate, recurring effort by fallen angels to corrupt humanity with hybrids.
This is getting really specific. So it's not just one big category of giants, but distinct types, like Nephilim versus Rephaim, each with their own traits and significance. Can you unpack those differences? Because that seems crucial to his whole argument, this level of detail.
Absolutely. The distinctions are vital. First up, the Nephilim. That's the Hebrew word translated giants back in Genesis 6.4, means bully, tyrant, giant. And that suffix, and it makes it plural, but also carries a sense of to be from or in ones, often used for, like the plural male majesty of angels, gods, and their male progeny.
Okay.
They were called mighty men, Gibor in Hebrew, which is sometimes a title for giants. But maybe most importantly, they were men of renown. Now, renown comes from Shem, which can mean famous or infamous. But Shamayim means lofty sky, heaven, heavenly ones.
Ah, so men from the heavenly ones.
Exactly. They weren't just big, they were from the heavenly ones, the fallen angels. They had this inherited false divine authority. This, the source argues, is where that first world order blueprint came from control, based on the lie of superior divinely linked bloodlines.
So the link to the fallen ones is right there in the name and description. Not just a descriptor, but about their actual origin and nature tied directly to the angelic rebellion.
Yes, very explicitly. Infiel itself comes from Nephal, or Nepal, meaning to fall, like Satan falling in Isaiah 14, or Jesus describing Satan falling like lightning in Luke 10. It firmly connects Nephilim to the fallen ones, Nephilim, or sons of God, Binaha, Elohim. And the author is adamant that sons of God, in places like Job and Daniel, refers to angels, not human descendants of Seth or Christians. He notes the Jewish Encyclopedia supports this, as do ancient texts like the Ugaritic ones, which mention B-U-M, sons of the god Elohim, including Baal. This is critical because it defines the source of their power and their ultimate allegiance.
Okay, so Nephilim, the original pre-flood tyrannical offspring of fallen angels.
Got it. What about the Rephaim? How are they different? What makes them stand out?
Right, the Rephaim. Raphas, the word appears about 25 times in the Old Testament. It means an invigorating giant, tribe of giants, with Rephaim being the plural. You see them in Genesis 14 and 15. Yeah. But here's the really interesting part, the key difference. Rapha also comes from Rapha, which means to cure, physician, heal.
Heal. Giants with healing powers. That's the implication. It suggests the Rephaim had these unique, maybe even supernatural abilities to heal their bodies, re-energize and reinvigorate themselves, and perhaps heal others. And this isn't just a biblical thing. He points to Ugaritic texts where Rephaim kings were called menkings of healing or even saviors, so they might have been seen as powerful, maybe even beneficial figures in some cultures, despite being giants.
That is genuinely intriguing. Giants as healers. And when do they appear in history compared to the Nephilim? Does their timing support that second incursion idea?
Crucially, yes. Rephaim are mainly linked with post-flood history. This makes them distinct from the pre-flood Nephilim. The source puts it like this. If Nephilim did not survive the flood, and Rephaim were not documented biblically before the flood, but populated the earth after the flood, it follows that Rephaim were procreated after the flood by fallen angels in a second incursion, by offspring gods of the Balaam. He cites Deuteronomy 2 here.
So their appearance after the flood is strong evidence for that second incursion theory. Explains how giants came back.
It provides significant biblical backing for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Suggests a deliberate, strategic restart of this corrupted lineage.
Okay, and lastly, the Anakim. Just another name or a specific subgroup. What's their deal on this whole story?
The Anakim Anakanaki are described as a tribe of giants. Yes, Deuteronomy 2 mentions them, but specifically as a branch of the Rephaim, not the Nephilim.
Oh, okay. A subset of the post-flood giants.
Exactly. And the author points to that famous evil report from the 10 spies in Numbers 13. Remember, they came back terrified.
Yeah, we were like grasshoppers in their sight.
Right. They exaggerated the Anakim, calling them giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, basically equating them with the fearsome pre-flood Nephilim to scare the Israelites. He argues this exaggeration actually proves the Israelites knew about and believed in the original Nephilim. It implies the Anakim, while still giants and definitely scary, were probably, well, maybe not quite as huge as the originals.
Yeah.
Josephus also called the people in Hebron the posterity of giants, backing up their giant status, even if maybe slightly smaller than their antediluvian ancestors.
Wow, expert. That's a really precise breakdown. So just to recap quickly for everyone listening, we're not just talking tall guys. We've got distinct lines. The pre-flood Nephilim tyrants, these mysterious post-flood Rephaim with healing powers, and then specific tribes like the Anakim, all carrying this thread of corrupted, non-human lineage. It sounds like making these distinctions is absolutely critical to his whole thesis. Right?
Foundational. You have to know who's who.
Okay. This is where things often get a bit murky, I think, in standard understanding. Our source makes this really crucial distinction between demons and devils and ties them directly back to these giants. What's the key takeaway here? Why is this distinction so important for understanding, well, spiritual warfare?
It's absolutely critical because, as the source argues, English translations often just lump them all together. They've conflated and confused demonic spirits and unclean spirits with other angelic beings and the devil Satan. This leads to a lot of misunderstanding about who's who in the hierarchy of evil.
Okay, so how does he separate them?
He defines demons, from the Greek daimon, as a demon, a supernatural spirit of a bad nature, an inferior deity like a demigod, and an evil spirit. You see this in Revelation. They are distinct from the devil, Greek diabolos, which refers specifically, singularly, to Satan, the false accuser, the prince of demons.
So Satan is the devil, the boss, and demons are like a lower rank under him, a different category.
Exactly. Satan is the top guy, the devil. Demons are a separate lower category of beings within that fallen angelic hierarchy reporting up the chain.
Okay. And the source gives a very specific and, yeah, unsettling origin for these demons. It's not just vague evil spirits, but a direct link to the giants we were just talking about.
Yes, precisely. This is a cornerstone of the argument. He proposes that demons are the disembodied Nephilim or Rephaim spirits. He cites the Book of Enoch here, specifically chapter 15.
Disembodied spirits of giants.
Wow. The theory is, when their hybrid physical bodies died, flood, battles, whatever their spirits were released, but because they had this corrupted, unnatural origin, part angel, part human, they weren't permitted to go to heaven like pure human spirits.
Okay.
And apparently they don't sleep like human spirits might while waiting for resurrection. They're just released. This, he argues, explains why they're always seeking bodies to possess. Remember Jesus in Matthew 12? When the unclean spirit is gone out of a man, he walketh through dry places, seeking rest and findeth none. They're restless, disembodied, desperately needing a physical anchor.
That is genuinely chilling. The demons we read about are the restless ghosts of ancient giants. Okay, what about unclean spirits? Same thing as demons, or another layer?
Pretty much the same category, according to the source. The terms unclean spirits, that's tuma in Hebrew, akathartos in Greek, both meaning impure, polluted, corrupted, defiled sexually, and devils, referring to demons in the New Testament, are often used interchangeably.
Yeah.
So yeah, practically speaking, same group of nasty, disembodied entities.
Okay.
He links them directly to the evil spirits that tormented King Saul in 1 Samuel, and also to familiar spirits, aub, which were seen as ghosts or spirits of the dead in Leviticus and Isaiah. And again, this connects back to those mumbling spirits in unknown languages like the gibberish linked to giants. It's a consistent thread, he argues.
So a very specific unsettling origin, tying them right back to those first angelic incursions. This idea of a counterfeit spirit sounds absolutely central to why these beings are fundamentally different from humans or angels.
It is completely central. The origination of the counterfeit demon spirit, as he calls it, comes from the corrupted spirit of fallen angels who passed on a counterfeit spirit into the physical world via physical copulation with human females to produce spurious offspring. This unnatural union created a spirit that wasn't fully human, wasn't fully angelic, just a corrupted hybrid.
And God's response in Genesis 6.3 about limiting lifespans to 120 years.
He interprets that as God limiting the lifespan of all flesh, specifically including these human-angel hybrids. This ensured their counterfeit spirit was unclean in its creation, and importantly would become disembodied when the physical body died, unable to go to heaven, unable to find rest. Josephus, interestingly, seemed to agree, noting the giants' lifespans were indeed cut to 120 years, a direct result of God's decree.
And what's the ultimate goal of these demons, these disembodied giant spirits? What are they trying to achieve, especially in the end times? How do they fit the bigger prophetic picture?
Their agenda seems pretty clear from this perspective. These are the evil spirits who deny Jesus is the Christ. They're described as having an antichrist-like spirit in 1 John. Their core mission, he states, is to manipulate their own demonic offspring, if any exist, and more broadly, to influence and possess humans. Why? To slander God and pave the way for the Antichrist.
Right.
They're always restless, always looking to possess bodies, trying to usurp a soul and body, just like Jesus warned. This sets the stage for the really direct, hands-on involvement in end-time events, where they'll try to embody themselves again, maybe through possession, maybe through other means, to fuel that final rebellion.
This whole idea of no new thing under the sun, it's such a powerful way to look at prophecy. Suggests the past is literally the blueprint for the future. How does this concept of the serpent's root connect all these ancient things, giants, fallen angels, corrupted bloodlines, to the really terrifying woes predicted for the end times? How does it bring it all full circle?
It really does tie it all together, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The author leans heavily on Ecclesiastes 1. The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be. There is no new thing under the sun. What this means prophetically is that the events of the days of Noah aren't just history lessons. They're a precise, chilling pattern for what's coming.
A pattern, okay.
He points to Revelation, chapters 9 and 12, as having these vivid and striking connections back to Noah's time. Specifically, the release of those impassioned angels and demons from the abyss, led by about an Apollyon, the destroyer angel. That's predicted as the first of the three terrifying woes.
Wow.
This directly links that ancient angelic rebellion and its fallout to the ultimate end-time judgment. The past isn't just rhyming, it's being replayed blow by blow.
So the ancient past is literally echoing or foreshadowing the future in detail. And that brings us to this really significant idea, the serpent seed line. What is that exactly? And how did this lineage supposedly play out through history, from Genesis right up to the end times, defining this cosmic battle?
He digs deep into Genesis 3.15, where God declares war between the woman's seed and the serpent seed. He interprets this as two literal, competing seed lines running through all of human history. There's Adam's pure human line, and then there's the serpent's line, the offspring of serpentine sons of God, the Seraphim, dragon watchers.
Seraphim, dragon watchers.
Yeah, Seraphim, described in Isaiah 6 as these fiery, six-winged watchers with serpentine faces, powerful angels. And in the physical world, dragons, or Tannin, where dragon watchers comes from, are defined as serpents or sea monsters, like in Isaiah 14.29. This serpent seed, he argues, is the infamous original house of dragon, a notorious rival seed line to Adamites, illicitly inserted both before and after the flood, which has plagued the epic of Adamites.
Illicitly inserted. So it's not just a spiritual conflict, but potentially a physical genetic one, too.
That's the implication.
Yeah.
He argues this lineage continues through what he calls beast bloodlines, right up to today. He points to Psalm 21, which talks about God destroying their fruit and seed from the earth. It suggests this ongoing, hidden struggle for control, not just good versus evil, but between two distinct, often unseen bloodlines.
That's a very clear and, terrifying lineage of evil, a hidden hand influencing history. And he connects this to the terrible ones in Isaiah 25. Who are they, and what's their ultimate fate in this end-time picture?
The terrible ones, that's Eret or Eretim in Hebrew, mentioned in Isaiah 25. They're identified as this branch, or strong people, as meaning fierce, mighty.
Yeah.
They're powerful, tyrannical, strong, violent oppressors and greedy ones.
Okay.
And he links them directly to Azazel, the scapegoat figure in Leviticus 16. In the Book of Enoch, Azazel is named as the leader of the watchers sent to the abyss.
Ah, okay, the connection makes sense.
And prophecy, he notes, points to their destruction upon the mountain towering over the end-time Armageddon battle. He suggests this is likely around the slopes of Mount Hermon, which is exactly where Enoch says the Watchers first came down to Earth.
Wow. Poetic justice, almost. Began there, ends there.
A terrifying symmetry, yeah.
And this all seems to plug right into Daniel's prophecies about those metallic empires. How do those ancient empires, with their declining value, lead up to the end-time beast and this final clash between the seed lines? It feels like the whole sweep of history from this viewpoint is laid out there.
Exactly. Daniel 2 lays out that sequence. Gold is Babylon, silver is Persia, bronze is Greece, iron is Rome. And it all culminates in this future end-time empire. The great image Nebuchadnezzar saw is described as giant-sized and terrifying, maybe even in the sense of a serpent somehow. The Aramaic word denchel for terrible can apparently also mean fear of serpents. Now, the author argues the decreasing value of the metals, gold down to iron mixed with clay, isn't just about political power declining. It symbolizes a steady decline in purity to the serpent seed bloodlines of the royals that included the nobility, priest, and elite classes who controlled and essentially enslaved the working class, along with the slave class Adamites.
So it's a spiritual and maybe even genetic corruption of the ruling lines, moving further from Adam's pure line.
That's the interpretation. A dilution, a corruption infiltrating the power structures down through history.
And then we get to the feet of Daniel's statue, the iron and clay. Those seem really key for the end times, representing this final, shaky, doomed alliance.
This is maybe the most crucial bit for understanding the end times through this lens. The 10 Toes Kings in Daniel 2 represent this future divided world empire. It's partly strong and partly broken, an alliance empire that the Antichrist will eventually take over. And the mix of iron and clay is critical. Iron represents the strength of those old empires, but clay is linked to humans. Adam was formed from clay earth. And the prophecy says, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay.
Mingle with the seed of men. That phrase just jumps out, expert. It sounds like more than just, intermarriage or political alliances. How does the source interpret that? What are the implications? Because it sounds jarring.
It is jarring. And the source presents it as a jarring understanding that really challenges standard theology, both church and secular. Mingle there is Arab, and seed is za, which can mean posterity or even semen.
Okay.
Although he argues it's not just about different human groups mixing. Instead, it implies either a distinct race or a less pure hybrid race of the ancient serpent seed bloodlines will mix or commingle with the seed men. This goes way beyond normal human mixing. It suggests something profoundly different happening at a genetic or spiritual level, a deliberate corruption of Adam's line, or emerging with something fundamentally non-human.
Wow. And then that other chilling phrase, they shall not cleave one to another. What does that suggest about this mingling and these end-time rulers? It sounds like an unstable, unnatural mix.
Exactly. Not cleave comes from debach, meaning to stick with, join, or impinge. It implies that even though this mingling happens, the union won't be stable, won't be harmonious, won't last. The source suggests the spirit mingling will occur in exchange for helping the kings come to power, or shortly thereafter.
So like a deal with the devil, almost.
Kind of. He suggests it could mean forcible possession, or maybe leaders being seduced into sharing their soul and body with dominant demon spirits. And this interpretation ties directly into Revelation 16, where those three unclean spirits, like frogs, spirits of devils, demons, come out of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet to gather the kings for Armageddon. It points to demons possessing or heavily influencing these final rulers, leading to this inherently unstable, internally conflicted final empire. It's basically a blueprint for a demonic takeover of world power.
Okay, this brings us to a really fascinating and, pretty unsettling question. If angels and demons are spirits, how exactly do they interact with our physical world? What does this idea of habitation mean for the future? How can a spirit have strange flesh or mingle with the seed of men so literally?
This concept of habitation is absolutely critical to Wayne's whole argument. Remember Jude 1. It says, the angels kept not their first estate, their arch, their original heavenly place and authority, but they left to their own habitation. That word is oikiterion, a specific residence, a dwelling place for the spirit.
A spiritual home.
Right. And they left it to engage in fornication with strange flesh. Heteros, meaning a different kind, species, or race, down in Sodom, doing it in like manner to how things were before the flood. Think of it this way. Our human bodies are the temporary dwelling, the habitation for our spirits, right? These angels deliberately abandoned their original spiritual house in heaven. They chose to manifest physically to engage in this illicit interspecies reproduction. This idea of habitation is key because it explains how spirit beings could literally interact with and corrupt the physical world, leading to the giants and this whole hybrid problem. They aren't just invisible influences, they can become physically present.
But wait, what about Jesus saying angels don't marry or procreate? That's a common counter-argument, isn't it? Seems like a direct contradiction.
It's a very valid question, comes up all the time. The author tackles it directly. He points out that those passages, Matthew 22, Mark 12, Luke 20, are talking specifically about resurrected humans in heaven being like the angels, neither marrying nor being given in marriage. And it refers to the angel's natural unfallen state in heaven.
Ah, so context is key.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He argues those verses do not say that angels cannot take physical forms and procreate in the physical world if they choose to, especially if they've fallen. In fact, the Bible itself gives examples. Hebrews 13 talks about entertaining angels unawares, meaning they look like normal people.
Right.
And even more clearly, Genesis 19 shows angels appearing as men. Lot knew they were angels men. The Sodomites saw them as men and, disturbingly, wanted to know them carnally. This biblical evidence, he argues, shows angels can take physical form and interact physically, sometimes in very transgressive ways.
And that desire of the Sodomites to know the angels in Genesis 19, that becomes really provocative here. Was it just homosexual lust? Or does the author suggest something way more sinister, given that phrase, strange flesh?
This is where he asks some really uncomfortable but critical questions based on strange flesh. He wonders, did the Sodomites just want homosexual relations? Or did they, maybe through their occult practices and pagan beliefs, want the angels to take female forms to create purebred Rephaim? Or maybe even create Rephaim directly with Sodom's daughters?
Wow.
The author suggests the Sodomites, influenced by their mystical religions and maybe their own Rephaim kings, actually possessed knowledge regarding fallen angelic changeling sexual and reproductive capabilities. The phrase strange flesh implies an unnatural interspecies violation was desired, not just human-on-human sin. It was maybe a desire to replicate the corrupted hybrid lineage they were already familiar with through their own giant rulers.
So our bodies are a habitation for our spirits, and angels can take on a physical habitation too. What are the huge, maybe terrifying future implications of this habitation idea as we get closer to the end times, especially thinking about fallen angels and demons?
He sees several major unsettling implications that link directly to end-time prophecies. First, those fallen angels who are not currently locked up in the abyss, the ones still roaming free, they might once more take bodily form to walk again among humans.
Why? What would they do?
Their goal, he warns, would be to guide their loyal followers and maybe even create more spurious offspring again to help in their schema, basically, restarting the giant problem all over again.
Okay, that's sobering. What else?
Second, the angels who are released from the abyss, like in Revelation 9, he expects them to also take bodily form during the first 3.5 years of the final 7. So we're talking direct physical manifestation of these incredibly malevolent beings on earth.
And for the demons, the disembodied giant spirits, what kind of habitation might they find or be given in this future scenario?
This is where it gets really, really disturbing. He suggests that demons from the abyss and those not in the prison will be possessing human hosts, which is bad enough, but also maybe having humans create other kinds of oiketerions for demon spirits as we close in on the last 7 years.
Other kinds of bodies, like what?
He speculates this could mean things like various kinds of cloned human bodies, chimera-like bodies, or some form of transhuman bodies provided for disembodied spirits of giants. All these entities, physically manifested angels, demons possessing people, demons maybe inhabiting specially made bodies. He warns they'll all be interacting directly, physically, and horribly with humanity in the end times, just as they had in the days of Lot and Noah. History looping back to its terrifying conclusion.
Wow. Okay. We have covered an incredible amount of ground today, a truly mind-bending deep dive into history, prophecy, just wow. From understanding this Christian contrarian approach, seeking out hidden history.
Right, to seeing the days of Noah and Lot not just as a surprise warning, but as this chilling prophetic blueprint for right now, for our era.
And unpacking those distinct giant types, Nephilim, Rephaim, Anakim, tracing their origins, their legacy across generations.
And grappling with that really sharp distinction between demons and devils, understanding that counterfeit spirit of the giants, always looking for a place to inhabit in our world.
And we saw how this ancient, this shadowy second history dominated by the serpent's root, the House of Dragon, connects right into Daniel's empires and that end-time beast system, especially that deeply unsettling prophecy about mingling with the seed of men.
Yeah, it highlights this continuous, ages-long battle between these competing seed lines, a conflict starting way back in Genesis, set to culminate in the final days.
This knowledge, even though it comes from way back, from prehistory, ancient texts, it really does shine a light on today, on the future. It gives you this profound lens to see maybe the hidden influences, that unaccounted for hidden hand playing out, to maybe prepare for what's coming.
It really equips you, potentially, to see through that veil that is spread over all nations, like Isaiah said, to see a reality that's maybe far more complex, more spiritually charged than we usually think. So here's a thought to leave you with. Considering these ancient texts describe giants and their serpent seed bloodlines, having this continuous influence on human power, what might the modern pursuit of immortality, genetic editing, or even transhumanism truly represent in this whole historical and prophetic context? Could these very current ambitions be, maybe, the latest version of that ancient desire to mingle with the seed of men, maybe unknowingly inviting a return of that strange flesh?
That is a powerful thought to ponder. Definitely something that lingers long after we stop talking. Keep digging, everyone. Keep questioning. Keep seeking knowledge, because the deep dive is always here to help you unpack more.